The God question absorbs me. I've oscillated between intrigued and obsessed. Does God exist? What is God like? Linguistic arguments and personal testimonials fuel the God debate. On the God arguments, I do not see much progress. On the God testimonials, I cannot attach much credence. I wouldn't trust my own feelings, much less those of others. But if arguments and testimonials both come up short, are there other ways of knowing, other ways of apprehending insight? I've always loved the arts, music, painting, poetry, but I'd never imagined until recently that the arts might have some special things to say about God. Not does God exist, but rather if God exists, what God might be like. Can art enter the God debate? Can art reveal God's traits? I'm Robert Lawrence Kuhn, and Closer to Truth is my journey to find out. If art can enter the God debate, how could this happen? I'd consider two ways. First, if a supreme being created the world, a world in which humans evolved and art became manifest, then would art reflect the capacities or interests of that being? Second, does art in religious contexts convey deeper meaning? I hear of a workshop, Art Seeking Understanding, a theme of the Templeton Religion Trust. Attending are philosophers of religion with diverse interests in the arts. Can connections between art and God be explored there? I decide to find out. I begin with a broad-ranging philosopher of religion who both believes in God and works on aesthetics, Nicholas Wolterstorff. Nick, one of the fundamental elements in philosophy of religion is to try to assess God's traits. And there's been God is the highest perfections, and what does it mean to be omnipotent? What does it mean to be omniscient, to know everything? These are very complex questions, but they're all verbal questions. We recognize that our language is insufficient, surely, to describe what God is if God exists. So the question I want to ask is, what vehicles do we have that are nonverbal? And the first thing you think about is art.
Among the most fundamental ways in which works of art present reality to us, well, one obvious way is representation, representing mountains and so forth. But a fundamental way, which especially the 19th century Romantics began to emphasize, is the expressive qualities of art. In the 50s, there were some experiments on what was called synesthesia, the phenomenon where when you have stimulation in one sense modality, some people have images in another.
You hear music, you see colors.
Yeah. The experiments led us to see that, no, all of us have a sense of fittingness, that a low musical tone fits better with a blunt instrument, and a high tone fits better with a sharp instrument, and so forth. I think that phenomenon, what psychologists call cross-sensory modalities, I think that's fundamental to the arts. And it's by virtue of that the arts have a power to present to us dimensions, aspects of God that you can't really put into words. Majesty. I mean, we can use the word majesty, and you can say some things about majesty, but a work of music, or some works of paintings, they present the divine majesty to us. You sort of feel it, hear it, and these are nonverbal. So I think, yes, the arts have a power to communicate to us majesty, awesomeness, the awesomeness of God. A composer can set himself, herself, to presenting the majesty of God, the holiness. We have all these settings in the Mass of the Sanctus settings. Bach has one understanding of God's holiness. This, how do I describe it? These descending, cascading notes. Awesome. Schubert has a much quieter understanding of God's holiness and our appropriate response. So composers present their understanding of dimensions of God to us, and you can't put it into words, but you can feel it, see it, sense it.
Granted, the arts can generate cascading feelings of awe, transcendence, majesty. But why should human feelings evolve for physical survival, enhance awareness of deep reality, connect with non-physical powers? Perhaps the issue is more subtle. Perhaps I should reverse the logic. What, if there were a God, might be God's manifestations in the world? I go to Nassau, the Bahamas, to ask the Emeritus Professor of Philosophy and the Arts at Princeton Theological Seminary, now Director of the Edinburgh Sacred Arts Foundation, Gordon Graham. Gordon, if there is a God, what can we, if anything, infer from art about the nature of God? Is that even a legitimate question?
It's certainly a legitimate question. I want to start, though, by saying that the way you phrase that expression, if there is a God, it already gestures in a certain direction where God and world are, in some sense, separate. Now, if you think that God is manifested in the world of which we are a part, then God will be apprehended in the fullest and most dynamic and richest form of experience. So that form of experience is going to include the moral and the aesthetic. If I asked you to name some of the greatest things that human experience has ever produced or encountered, then artworks would be up there, moral accomplishments would be up there, moral progress would be up there, and it would be far beyond, in that sense, far beyond molecules in motion or something of that sort. So if we believe that God is revealed in experience, and that God is the sum of all perfections, then we will clearly and unmistakably see something of God's greatest nature manifested in the highest aspects of experience, of which the artistic will be one.
Do the arts have a special place because of the nature of it, the emotion, the creativity, the imagination? Because when we talk about God normally in theology, we talk about all the omnis, so omnipotent, all-powerful, all-knowing, all free, or all good. And we never emphasize the sort of the artistic aspects of it.
That's true, but that's the language of the theologians. But what I introduce thinking is in the biblical expression that God is a spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. Now, the notion of the spiritual is interesting here. So the spiritual, if I'm just thinking Hegelian terms, the spiritual is that which is less and less dependent upon the matter in which it appears. So it does appear in matter. But if I just take a simple example of a picture, then I paint a picture of a house, let us say. The house is in the picture, but if you analyze the pigment and the canvas and all the rest of it, you won't come across a house. So the idea of a house being in a picture is, strange though it may seem, a spiritual object that is not primarily dependent upon the matter in which it is manifested. So that's the sense, the Hegelian sense, in which it's more spiritual. And that's the sense in which, in art, we better apprehend the spirituality of God.
But do the arts give us an opportunity to talk about positive assertions about God?
The highest apprehensions of experience, our experience, as spiritual beings, not meaning that in some sort of ghostly way, but spiritual beings, will indeed be apprehensions of the divine nature. So that will include moral experience, and such things as human relationships at their deepest and fullest, in love, for example, but also in the apprehension and the creation of beauty. And so in the old creation story, when it says God created the heavens and the earth and saw it was good, the goodness here will incorporate its beauty.
Here's Graham's argument. If God created the world, then God is manifest in the world, and thus God's traits can be apprehended from the fullest and richest forms of human experience, which certainly feature the arts. Here, art creating beauty is what counts, irrespective of the kind or content of the art. It's art as God's fingerprint, as it were, beauty as evidence of God's presence. Now, to me, art and beauty would seem a weak argument for God's existence. But flipped around, assuming God's existence, would art and beauty enhance our understanding of God? I worry, though, am I falling into a subtle trap of circular reasoning? What's a way out? Perhaps art in a religious context. Art whose content is or claims to be about God. There is, of course, a long and well-connected history of art and religion. Attending the Art Seeking Understanding workshop is an art historian who focuses on Byzantine and medieval art, Matthew Milliner.
Matt, is it possible to infer anything about God, the traits of God, from the existence of art?
Yes, especially if you go back to the native Jewish wisdom of that absence in the Ark of the Covenant, or the native Christian wisdom of the absence at the Holy Sepulchre, where you don't find Jesus' body. He has risen. And if you do that, unfortunately, a Christian artist approved by the church might not be the best place to go, because they might be giving you a more satisfying, immediately palatable depiction of God with cheesy Christian iconography, if you'll forgive the term. Whereas a contemporary artist, I'll give you an example, Anish Kapoor, he did Cloud Gate in Chicago, famously known as The Bean, nicknamed, but he's an incredible artist, and he intervened at San Giorgio Maggiore, outside of Venice, and he decided to create some kind of vacuum mechanism. So you had almost this cyclone-like spiral of dust going up out of the cathedral. So you walk in, and it is a reminder that God cannot be contained in this space. Did Anish Kapoor want that to be communicated? Would he sign on theologically to what the Catholic Church believes? I'm not sure. But what I do know is that he may have communicated the infinite mystery of God more effectively than a bona fide Christian artist.
Now, there are two ways to look at this question. One is, how can art depict God, or not depict God, as it may be? Second way is, how can the existence of art per se reflect on, if there is a God, what that God could be like?
Yeah. And that's where I would always want to complement the artistic depictions with what I believe to be the trustworthiness of the revelation of God in Christ that we learn about through the Bible. And so when that conversation is there, I don't mean that as a straitjacket. It certainly wasn't that for Vincent van Gogh, who was inspired by that tradition. But I mean that as a liberator. Instead of some Feuerbachian projection of what I want God to be or think God could be, or some internal mechanism that I'm projecting onto the sky, all of those things are true. People do that. We have a name for it. It's called idolatry. But you want to break through that and let God speak. And in so doing, there are great moments throughout the Old Covenant and the New Covenant, to use Christian terminology, where he seems to communicate himself using physical stuff.
And now, how does that comport with the second commandment about not to make idols and to graven images? And
it always is true, that second
why
commandment.
was that so important?
Because,
I mean, number two.
Because of a fast food religion that was circulating in the ancient Near East. Here you go. This is everything you need to know about God. And of course, then oppression comes with that, because this is the true God, and then we're going to crush you. But in some senses, the prohibition against verbal and visual flippancy in regard to God is something that Christians have constantly violated. We see it all the time when Christians too casually say, I saw God doing this, or I saw God doing that, or this is what God looks like with some horrible image. That's the mistake. And so we have to constantly bring the wisdom of the Decalogue into these conversations to, in some senses, check casual Christian visual culture. And that's what I think some contemporary artists do a lot better than Christian artists so-called sometimes do.
So what would you approve?
I would approve an image that evokes mystery, that reminds me that God is not under my control. In 1 Kings chapter 8, when Solomon finally creates the temple, He creates it, and then the first thing he says in the dedication, oh, by the way, God can't contain you. Don't have you in a cage. You're not in a box. The train of your robe can't even fit in this temple, let alone you. And so that's the way to do it, to use art, but to constantly remind ourselves of its limitations.
So that's what we call an apophatic tradition,
Exactly.
which is you can only know what God is not.
Right.
So is that what you're saying? That
Exactly. The luminous darkness of apophatic
So
theology.
anything that's representational, you'll reject?
No, not at all. Because God became flesh and matter matters, there is the other side of it. Now, it sounds like I'm trying to have it all, but that's exactly what I'm trying to have, because I think Christianity sure has a lot within it. You get to have the veneration of matter, the devotion to physical things, but you also have to remember that there's so much more than the physical. A nice summation, Nicene Creed, I believe in all things, visible and invisible.
Abstract art expressing a mysterious, ineffable God. I see that, so to speak. Less so how representational art can, well, represent manifestations of God. I feel I'm spiraling into what's called apophatic knowledge. God can be known only in the negative. All we can know is what God is not. Can art enrich apophatic knowledge? Enhance appreciation of a limitless God beyond human conception. To get at this, I speak with an artist and art critic who explores capacities and limitations of the visual arts, especially in religious contexts, Jonathan Anderson.
Jonathan, can the arts give us positive things to say about God?
Two things come to mind. One, the arts have been, historically, a way of thinking through sacred texts, thinking through the way the world appears. And so the arts do function as a kind of visual commentary about a scriptural text or about the world, this sort of natural theology. It provides sites for thinking through what those things mean. And they do it not in a way that is convertible back to language, verbal language, but operates with a visual language in itself, or a spatial language. So in those senses, you kind of have to adopt some kind of religious standpoint, some sort of position in which the arts are commenting and unfolding and extrapolating.
That's fair.
The second thing is that the arts do think about representability and unrepresentability, and I'm quite interested in the apophatic tradition, actually, and the ways that the arts open up a kind of apophatic thought. The arts give images as commentary, and then often also reinforce or draw attention to their limits, the limit of representation and representation of God specifically. And the arts provide that function all over the place, both within religious communities and outside of religious communities. And this is particularly an issue in the 20th century. In modern and contemporary art, the apophatic and the limits of what is sayable about God is an issue throughout modern art.
So how do you see the icons, the images, the religious images that are pervasive? How do they reinforce an apophatic? Because I don't see in the image a self-undermining.
In the case of icons, there is an undermining. One of the reasons why the thing flattens, the images flatten so much and become so stylized is not
Because they're bad artists.
Yeah, exactly. No, they arrived at that position after actually mastering visual representation. You move from Greek examples to the flatness of the medieval icon or the Byzantine icon, specifically as a way of saying that which is represented here is not contained here. And that's an example of where we have the arts performing, I think, quite a rigorous and interesting apophatic thought or apophatic movement. Loads of examples. To pull one, Kazimir Malevich famously installed in his exhibition 010 a painting of a black square on a white background. It was to go in the holy corner, which for Orthodox Christians would be where your most sacred icon would go. And everyone who saw the show knew that he was putting an icon there, and he talked about it as an icon of our age. But it's an icon of the unrepresentable. It is a way of asserting the function of an icon and preserving that, and also withholding representation. It is overtly an apophatic icon.
If art can, in some sense, access the inaccessible God, wouldn't art need to do so devoid of sectarian doctrine? Then wouldn't art have the capacity to harmonize diverse religions? But would a generalized God be a worthy God? I ask a British philosopher of theology, religion, and the arts. He is an Anglican priest with an ecumenical persuasion, David Brown.
It seems to me that the arts can help in thinking about the nature of who God is and what sort of character God has. And I think often in surprising ways. So, for example, if we're trying to relate the different religions to one another, they initially seem hugely different. And they are different in many ways, but not often in ways that people suppose. So take a typical Christian attitude to Hinduism. So Hinduism has lots and lots of gods. So the average person in the Christian pew will say it's simply idolatry and that's an end of it. That's completely misread Hinduism, it seems to me, where the aim of the image is, as it were, overkill. So you have lots of different types of image because God is never completed in any one of them. So actually, if you take any of them literally, you've misread. And that's why the more refined version of Hinduism says, actually, there's one divine reality. And so the object of the images is to say, well, think of God in this way, think of God in this way, think of God in this way. And so when a Hindu goes to a temple, they ask to be blessed by those different aspects, each of which contribute to the way in which they understand God. And by contrast, Christianity, it seems to me, is often in danger of idolatry precisely because it tries to tie down God too much. And that's one reason why it's got into problems in the modern world as change happens, and it doesn't know how to come to terms with change. So my response there would be look at the way arts open up new ways of, even in the West, of thinking about God. So there's a temptation in religion to simplify. So here's the rule book, and you've now got it, and so on. And I'd suggest that what the arts do is constantly open that again and say, no, things are not quite that simple. And I suppose by inference, then, God's desires are not quite as simple as we might have initially have supposed. So how is God present in suffering? You might get a more complicated answer if you started looking at various discussions of that in the arts. God remains ultimate mystery, so there's a sense in which we never get at him. But we can see aspects of him through the arts, which would, in my view, simply confirm what's been traditionally affirmed about the divine.
I welcome art as an entrant in the God debate. How could art reveal God's traits? Two kinds of ways. First, if God is the creator, the creation would convey imprints of its creator. And because the arts are special in expressing creativity, the arts may be special in accessing God. Second, art in religious contexts, representing sacred texts and concepts, is good for some. Describing an indescribable infinite being is good for me. But it would be error to constrain how the arts might reveal God's traits. Diverse perspectives of art and God are needed, portraying non-verbally divine majesty, apprehending God by fullest, richest forms of experience. expressing limitations in seeing God and venerating sacred matter, providing visual commentary on sacred texts and discovering apophatic knowledge, what God is not, harmonizing diverse religions. Art cannot defeat atheism, prove theism. That's not the question. But art as God's fingerprint, that is the question. I'd put my answer in the conditional tense. If there is a higher reality, then the arts as enricher and unifier can bring us closer to truth.
For complete interviews and for further information, please visit closertotruth.com.